Can you hear me? Is that coming through? Awesome. Hey, friends. I'm not a preacher, and I promised Carl I wouldn't upstage the sermon, so we'll see. I'm going to set myself a timer because I could talk forever about this person. Yeah, so for most of you probably know we've been doing these kind of like storytellings of, the faces of the faith, people who personally have kind of transformed our faith. And I'm going to tell my story in a kind of 3-part series, so hopefully we'll keep it under the 10-minute goal, but I don't know. We'll do an introduction, this person's story, and then like the impact after that. Some of you might know my story, upbringing a little bit, but like a lot of people that were raised in the 90s, grew up, evangelical churches, mine non-denominational kind of experience. Grew up in a missionary family, so I was kind of raised in that kind of world, that bubble. So I, had a lot of kind of transformation as I was becoming a young adult. Found this community in like 2005. Started shaking me up a little bit. I had a bit of a crisis of faith with the church I grew up in. One of the programs that we did here for a couple years was a program called the Apprenticeship. And it was kind of just like an in-depth 9-month kind of reading thing. And it was honestly the first time I had ever really thought about my theology, like at all, really, aside from just kind of what I was being told to believe from the church I grew up in. And it really kind of challenged me to kind of look at my faith a little differently. And I started reading, books about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or, one for our time was Shane Claiborne's Irresistible Revolution. And it kind of was like, oh, whoa, this is a very different experience of faith, or interpretation of faith. And it kind of just started to crack open my shell a little bit. And some of you might know too, I was in I dropped out of college, moved to Pittsburgh, and joined a punk band. My parents were thrilled. And so I was still playing in that band. We were part of this community here, and traveling around the country, and we had some good friends in East Nashville that kind of had a punk house that did shows there, and just like good community of folks, similar backgrounds as us. Kind of like some of them grew up in the church, were kind of ex-evangelicals like us, and were really struggling with their faith. And there was a sign, a handmade sign that was like hand stitched, hanging above their sink in this kind of community house, and it just said, "Everybody wants a revolution, but no one wants to do the dishes. Dorothy Day." And I was like, wait a second, I've heard that name before, and I think it had come up in Shane Claiborne's book. It had come up in a couple of things that were reading this person, and I had no idea who this was. This was before I had a smartphone and could just Google stuff. But I knew that she was like some kind of writer, and was like Catholic in some sense. But that writing hit me kind of right at a time that I was really wrestling with, what Christianity meant to me, because I was kind of losing a lot of the bricks of that foundation that I thought I had. And so I came home to Pittsburgh after that tour, and I don't know if some of you guys remember City Books, the old bookshop here on Carson Street. I walked down to City Books, and I just went in there. It was kind of a ramshackle, glorious place of its day, R.I.P. And walked in, and I just said, "Do you have anything about or by Dorothy Day?" And the older lady there was, she was like, "Oh, you know what? I think a couple of weeks ago, we got a book of hers in." I was like, "Really?" And then she turned around, and they had a mound of books, literally just a mound of books behind the counter. And she just started digging through this mound, and she goes, "Oh, here it is, Dorothy Day's The Long Loneliness. It's her autobiography." And I was like, "Oh, that sounds cool. Yeah, read something about her, written by her. That's great." And so that's kind of like how I was introduced to Dorothy Day, just like lightly here and there. And then I started digging into this book, and I'm not joking when I say this book, when I started reading it, changed my life. It absolutely was like what I needed to hear, the story that I needed to read at that time, that kind of crisis of faith I was in, because I was really struggling. The juxtaposition here was I was struggling a lot with what I was raised and told I needed to believe, like in my mind and my thought. And here comes someone very different experience to me, was not raised in the church. She grew up in New York City, became a radical, was a writer for a socialist paper called the Daily Worker. She was a part of a radical union called the IWW, was a labor organizer, was getting arrested. She was like the other spectrum on faith, non-faith, on politics, on everything that I was raised with, but was challenging what she believed. And she ended up, long story short, again, I could talk forever. Like she ends up converting to Catholicism kind of throughout her life. And she, partly because she met a man named Peter Marin, who co-founded what, I'm wearing the t-shirt, got the t-shirt, the Catholic Worker Movement is kind of what she started. And so she had this kind of transformation experience that then, where she was, moving into this kind of radical understanding of what faith meant to her, that the faith wasn't just about what you believed. And she was a pretty doctrinaire Catholic. She converted to Catholicism, and she was like, okay, the teachings of the church, great. But the Catholic Church had this awesome thing called Catholic social teaching. And so a lot of what they grew out of in this movement was they started saying like, oh, what if we actually took this thing seriously? And honestly, pairs so well with Carl's sermon this morning. Like, what if the gospel actually meant what it said? What if Jesus meant what he said when he said, you gotta, the works of mercy from Matthew 25? What if we actually should feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, house those who do not have housing? What if we care for the sick, visit the prisoners, maybe even free the prisoners, and, honor the dead? And they just started saying like, okay, what does that community, what does that radical Christian community look like in New York City in 1933? And so, she just started, getting together with other folks, started, kind of saying, all right, let's start, and they called them houses of hospitality. And so their movement kind of grew out of this like radical understanding of hospitality and saying, okay, if we're going to take the gospel seriously, and she had this kind of radical political past too, where they also kind of had that mindset of like everyone's included. Especially those on the margins, especially those who have been exploited, who have been oppressed by the systems that be. And so they said, okay, and what if we merge that with the gospel that also says these things? Like, what if that's what Christianity is about? And so she had all sorts of amazing teachings, on that. She would travel around, just like talk to folks. They started a newspaper. The Catholic Worker was a newspaper, and it, just spread around the country, around the world. The Catholic Worker movement, is still around, has 200 some communities around the country, around the world. These small little places of hospitality where just regular folks just say, what if we took the gospel seriously and lived like it said? So anyway, that's a little bit of her history. And then, I was out in, so I was in Kansas City. My wife's from Joplin, Missouri. We had mutual friends in Kansas City. And I was at a wedding with, some mutual friends of ours. And I was talking with a mutual friend there, and I was just like, oh man, I've been reading this book about this crazy awesome woman named Dorothy Day, who was committed to voluntary poverty, to Christian pacifism, rejecting war and violence and the oppression of the state. And she's really into this radical hospitality and works of mercy. And I was like, oh my God, this book is changing my life. And he goes, no way. He said, I just started volunteering at Cherith Brook Catholic Worker here in Kansas City. I was like, no way. Their communities still exist? Because I didn't know they were around. I was just like, this woman from 1933 started this thing. Wasn't that cool? Way back then? He goes, no, it's still around. Like, why don't you come to the Catholic Worker and like volunteer for the day? So while we were still in town, I was like, okay. I walked into this, they bought some old houses, and they just had meals all throughout the week, not too different than what we do here at the table, just open to anyone coming in. They had shower houses there, and they didn't know me, but I walked in and said, how can I help? I said, here's some vinegar, go clean the showers. After someone comes out, go wipe them down. I was like, okay. And so this to me was doing the dishes. If I wanted to see a revolution in the faith in the world, in real life, do the dishes. And so that's kind of like the motto that just kind of stuck with me. And so here I am, like meeting these people. It turns out the people that started this were Protestants. They weren't Catholic at all. They're Presbyterian pastors. It was a pastor family. A couple that started this, they committed to voluntary poverty, opening these houses. And they said, oh, in a couple months, we're having a faith and resistance retreat, is what they called it. And all these Catholic worker houses and community folks and volunteers from the Midwest area are going to come together. We're going to have a retreat. And there's a a nuclear weapons facility built by Honeywell that they're building here in Kansas City, and we've been organizing to try to shut it down because they're taking money that should be for blighted, oppressed communities, and they're doing all these, loopholes to steal that money from communities and put it into this weapons facility because job creation. And I was just like, oh, it's terrible. I was like, sure, yeah, let's do that. So I show up to the Faith and Resistance retreat, and it was a whole weekend of just like learning about not just like the teachings of the works of mercy, but just like hearing people's story about the work that they're doing in their communities and all across the country. And it just kind of blew my mind, just like meeting people that were kind of living this out in this kind of radical way. Also being anchored in this community here was also wrestling with that. It was about the time that I think this community started doing the table and started kind of taking that work, really seriously. And I was just, I was like, this example of faith is something that can keep me around. Because honestly, I was ready to just like jump ship with my experience with the church and all that. I was just like, I just didn't see something real and authentic and honoring to who, I still thought Jesus was cool. I was like, Jesus still got some good stuff going on. But I just felt like the church had moved so far away from what Jesus actually taught in real life. And so here I was at this retreat and all this stuff, and they said, oh, and by the way, we're going to go protest this nuclear weapons facility, which we've been doing for months now. And, don't worry, no one's gotten arrested, but, the cops might show up and get us in trouble. And I was like, all right, that sounds great. And here we go, we crossed the property line to try to like disrupt, the building of that facility. And they ended up arresting like 52 of us. There was, half of us men, half of us women that were like kind of there, a part of it. And they threw us in the drunk tanks at the prison to overnight stay at the jail. And they were really trying to pressure the movement there in Kansas City to not continue doing this, because they hadn't arrested us yet, but it kept on growing and growing and growing. And now there was 50-some people trying to cross over the property line. So we all got arrested. We all got, misdemeanors for, trespassing and all that stuff. And it was just this whole, but honestly, like that night in jail, and even just the experience at that protest where, we were singing hymns, we were singing, we shall not be moved, all the kind of civil rights hymns as well. And we were just like singing, and I thought to myself that like for the longest time, I had not felt like the Spirit alive in my life. And in that moment, it was like a revival. It was like a conversion moment for me, or I kind of refer to as a second baptism. So baptism by jail, And so, I spent 24 hours in the jail talking to these folks. This one Catholic priest, who's one of the leaders of the Catholic worker community, had spent a combined like 6 years of his life in jail protesting weapons and nuclear weapons in the United States. And I just was like, I don't know if that's my calling, but awesome for you. And his story was just so profound to me. Like he really believed that, if we're going to follow our faith, we really have to, it requires some sweat equity. It requires you actually doing something about it. And so I'm at 12 minutes. I'm going to wrap it up. So I came back to Pittsburgh. Long story short, I bought my house. The house that I still have now was a Catholic worker house for 2 years. And so we welcomed in homeless friends, friends we knew from this community, from the table. And I wish it could have lasted longer for reasons I won't go into. It didn't last beyond two some years. But in those 2 years, I made some of the deepest like friendships, friends I still have to this day, who were folks that were really going through a lot of really hard life struggles. And just how much that transformed me and my life and my faith. Just the story of Dorothy Day, who and she was famous for saying like, don't call me a saint. Even she's in the process of being sainted in the Catholic Church, and she famously said, don't call me a saint, you'll let me off too easy. And like her whole thought was just like, it's not about me. She obviously very impactful. She said, anyone can do this. This is what Jesus called all of us to do. We're all called to kind of live our faith radically. If it doesn't make you uncomfortable, we might not be doing it right. So I could talk on and on about it. If you want to talk with me anytime, I'd love to talk about the Catholic worker and Dorothy Day. Thanks for listening to me.